Hi, I'm Bray Patrick-Lake. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Evidation Health. I have a very broad educational and work background. I have an undergraduate degree in zoology. I've done some field work, and then I had a career as an actor for many years in New York and Los Angeles. And interestingly, that at one point drove me to want to take people to jail when I was in Hollywood. And so I went back to school and got a master's in forensic science, and I had a career in law enforcement, and I was a police officer in Colorado. And then I founded a nonprofit for the unsheltered homeless and worked in nonprofit for many years. And also at that point had a medical event and ended up founding a disease advocacy organization and getting involved in patient advocacy full time. I was a patient who, one, I was struggling to get unbiased scientific information about my disease, and I was very much finding out that whatever doorway I entered, if it was a surgeon, then I got a surgical option. If it was a medical provider, then it was medical therapy, and there was no good unbiased information available to patients that helped me make treatment decisions. And so I was on my search. I was not doing well with therapies that were available. And, I was kind of running out of options, and my quality of life was very low at the time. And so I started researching clinical trials. And I joke to this day, I'm probably the only person who's self-referred off of clinicaltrials.gov to a clinical trial. So I self-referred, I got selected, and then of course I was concerned that I wasn't even going to qualify in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, so I thought I would screen out, and I ended up being in a trial where I received an implanted cardiac device. It was a randomized controlled trial, and unfortunately the study was aborted for low and slow enrollment, and I was never notified by my site. In fact, the sponsor basically announced it in the press, and I received it via Google alert. And in my online patient group, I knew that while I was doing well, other patients were having some adverse events. And so it was very distressing to me. And another patient, she did not have a good outcome. And I ended up doing some advocacy on her behalf and spoke at an FDA public hearing on the need for transparency and sharing clinical trial data with patients. And so from that, I ended up being in the FDA patient rep program and getting involved in a lot of national issues related to clinical trials, because some of them are systemic and they can't be solved by one individual patient or one individual patient advocacy organization. And so I started working at the national level through the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is an FDA public-private partnership hosted by Duke University, with all of the stakeholders to really come together and, resolve some of these issues in the clinical trial enterprise that then help us do higher quality and more efficient research and get answers to patients in a more timely fashion. There are many opportunities for patients to get involved in clinical trial design, and I would even take it one step further to say really, research and medical product development, it's a cycle that starts with understanding unmet need and understanding therapeutic burden. So what are patients currently living with their disease? Are there side effects from medical products? Do they not have the medical products they need to address the symptoms that are most burdensome, or to slow the progression and or cure disease? And I think patients sometimes, when they hear the word research, they think they don't have experience, or that you need a scientific degree to be involved in some way, which is completely not true. Your lived experience is actually very valuable, and that of your care partners as well. And so it can be as simple as just responding to a survey that maybe comes out from the foundation asking you, what's the most burdensome symptom, or tell us about your quality of life. And so, providing that information, you are very valuable in clinical trial design, because that helps us understand what we should be measuring in a clinical trial that is an endpoint. And sometimes we're not measuring the right things. And so it's incredibly important for patients to let us know, and maybe new measures need to be developed and then explored. There's also a huge role in designing the trial itself. It's very important to understand from the patient perspective Can they access the sites? Are there things that we should be doing direct to participant because it's easier to do in home and not for patients have to come in clinic or travel to a place? It can be as easy as talking about, your ability to get into a building. If you've gone to a site, is the parking in a location that you can access it? Can you afford to pay for the parking, or should that be part of the trial design where patients are compensated? Should there be a navigator, because the medical campus is very large and confusing, and it helps to have somebody come and help patients actually get into the study appointments. So all of that, it doesn't require a PhD. It just requires being a person and being willing to share some of your time and the expertise you have living with your disease to really help design a trial. And then I like to really think about what's the value of participation, and so why would patients be in this trial? Sometimes we know that there are patients that in what we would call an interventional trial with new medical products, patients might receive access to a product and other patients might be in a control group where they're receiving standard of care. And there needs to be benefit for both groups. The opportunity to contribute to scientific knowledge is always important, but I still think that the patients have a real opportunity to say, this is what we need to be part of this trial. And that can even be, talking about the educational needs. I'd like to, to have the opportunity to learn more about my disease while I'm participating in the trial. And if I'm sitting, in a clinic and I'm having a medical procedure or having, to go to a clinic visit, there are things that the staff could do in the study design to ensure that you get to speak to a nurse or some other qualified health professional during that encounter, and you could learn more about your disease and ask some questions, which ends up being kind of an organic benefit that you wouldn't necessarily read about in the informed consent. Over the last 10 years, we have had a real shift in, you hear the buzzword patient centricity, and it's kind of funny because you would think this would be all about the patient, but oftentimes patients weren't in the room for clinical trial design or medical product design. And there was a lot of people who did thinking for patients, like nurses or doctors, clinical experts who said, well, this is what the patient feels. And then there's actually a lot of good research showing that sometimes those two perspectives are not aligned. And so you need to go directly for the patient. And we started having, I guess a cultural shift around this is what we should be doing because it's the right thing to do. But now we're at the place of, the science of patient input, and it's actually become a science where we're more skillfully through scientific methods understanding what's the best way to elicit patient and caregiver experience and apply that to clinical trial design, care design, medical product development. And then if you follow, U.S. regulations and Food and Drug Administration, there was an actual act called the 21st Century Cures Act that kind of codified that. And, while the FDA was a willing partner, it did put out some mandates to find better ways to capture patient experience data and to apply it to a regulatory framework. And so we've done that, and we have that going where FDA is very open, and so sponsors of clinical trials and I think academic medical centers are doing a much better job of engaging patients. And so that's been a big shift. And then there was also kind of the question of, okay, so it's the right thing to do and we know it, but what's the economic value? Because sometimes it does cost money if you're going to use, a new method and incorporate and engage patients. We want to ensure that patients are compensated for their time and they're valuable members of trial teams. And so now there's an actual economic model that shows an economic benefit to engaging patients. So there's a return on investment aside from it being the right thing to do. We now have a way to do it, and we can show that there is an economic value. And so I think all the pieces are in place, and you'll be seeing more opportunities to participate in the future. Well, I will basically, some of the key points I've highlighted about the incredible opportunities, and I will go through, I think, more specific opportunities from developing a study concept to assisting with securing funding or creating a study procedure or protocol, all the different roles that patients can play. And so it can get people thinking about how they may be able to get involved. There's also an entire body of work around, returning results. So I'm a huge believer that if you participate in a study, you should at least find out a summary of what happened in the study. And sometimes the way that we do clinical trials, it's not possible. If you told a patient that they were, say, what their response was to a certain medication, it could bias the study. But at some point, we should be able to share back, a person's individual results. But we're actually working through new frameworks of developing how we would do that. And so I'll speak a little bit, I think, about the return of results and things that perhaps we could all do, and kind of voting with our feet and our voice to ensure that patients always find out what happened into a trial. It's as important if it was a negative study or something that didn't achieve an endpoint, that what some people might say is failure. Those are incredibly important failures because we don't want to waste resources going back down the cul-de-sacs. But unfortunately, historically, a lot of the trials that got published, it wasn't the negative studies, it was the ones that were positive studies. And so I think, we can talk a little bit at the summit more about return of results and transparency and that importance and the role that patients can play in that area as well. I think every single patient voice and caregiver voice is valuable. And it's just a matter of harnessing that power and doing what you can, to get involved. And I think sometimes we might see a survey come through our email and it's like, oh, I don't need to answer that. The truth is that we all do. We all need to, to play our part. And there are just different things that we're able to do. When living with disease, we'll have different abilities and different energy levels at different times. But really thinking about all of the different opportunities and finding a way, to be supportive and to provide your voice. And just, the one message I want to leave is that everybody's voice is important. And if you don't talk about your patient experience, a lot of times we don't know. I think, again, scientists might think they know what's most important to patients, but it might not actually be that. And so all of us have a role to play in ensuring that we develop, clinical trials and medical products that meet the needs of patients first and foremost.